Daniel Roberts was dead, and no one in Crestwood could explain how or why. His body had been discovered in the very living room where, just hours earlier, he had been the man everyone trusted. The man who built their homes, their community, their futures. His death hit the town like a thunderclap, shattering the illusion of perfection that Crestwood had worked so hard to maintain. Roberts' construction supply had been more than just a business. It was the backbone of the town, and Daniel, its unshakable pillar. But in the quiet of that spring night, with the flickering glow of the streetlights casting eerie shadows on his lifeless form, it became clear that something had been hiding beneath the polished veneer of his life. Something dark, waiting to surface. The secrets that would unravel in the wake of his death would tear apart the very fabric of Crestwood, revealing that not even its golden man was beyond suspicion. That night, a thick layer of clouds obscured the light in the sky of the town of Crestwood. Even the air felt heavier than usual, as if the night itself were holding its breath, waiting for something unspeakable to happen. Laura Roberts, 44, drove into the driveway of her pristine two-story home on Oakwood Road. Her black sedan gleamed like polished stone in the dim light of the streetlights. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the front lawn, creating strange shapes that wavered in the wind. For a moment, Laura paused, staring at the house with a strange feeling of dread curling in her chest. It was just a house, but something about the stillness unnerved her. She shook the thought away as she glanced at the time on her dashboard. 11:14 p.m. Her dinner with friends had run later than expected, but the laughter and wine had been a welcome escape from the pressures that had been mounting at home. Daniel had complained of not feeling well earlier that day. Just some dizziness, maybe a bug going around. He had brushed it off with a wave of his hand and insisted that she go enjoy herself. But now, standing in the silence of the night, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that she should have stayed home. She closed the car door behind her, the sound too loud against the oppressive quiet. The front door creaked open with a long, mournful groan as she stepped into the house. The dim glow from a lamp in the hallway cast an unnatural light on the walls, making the shadows seem to move as if they had a life of their own. The air inside felt cold, stagnant, as if the house had been waiting too long for her return. "Daniel," she called softly, her voice tentative, almost as if she didn't want to disturb the quiet. There was no response, only the eerie stillness of the house, heavy and unnatural. The scent of the room was off, not quite musty, but something that sent a shiver up her spine. Her heels clicked on the hardwood floor, each step echoing louder than the last as she moved deeper into the house. There was an unnatural weight in the air, thick and suffocating. Her heart began to race, the silence gnawing at her nerves. Where was he? Laura turned the corner into the living room, and that's when she saw him. Daniel was there, but not in any way she had expected. He lay on the couch, his body disturbingly still. His head was tipped back against the cushion, his eyes half open, frozen in a lifeless gaze at the ceiling. A gasp escaped her lips, and for a moment time seemed to stop. The room was frozen in that moment, an eerie tableau of the domestic life shattered by death. Daniel's skin, once a healthy bronze from working outdoors, was now a sickly pale gray. His lips, slightly parted, were tinged with blue. The sight was wrong, unnatural in every way. Laura stood rooted in place, her breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps as she struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. "Daniel!" The word was a strangled cry as she rushed forward, dropping her purse to the floor. She shook him, her hands trembling as they gripped his shoulders. "Daniel, wake up, please, wake up!" But his body was cold, cold and lifeless, as if all the warmth had been drained from him long ago. Her mind screamed at her to do something, anything but she couldn't move. Her hands slipped from his shoulders, trembling violently as she stumbled backward. With trembling fingers, she fumbled for her phone, her vision blurred by tears she didn't remember shedding. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the coffee table before she snatched it up again. Her fingers danced across the screen as she dialed 911, the operator's calm voice a stark contrast to her hysteria. "My husband, he's not breathing. I don't know what happened. Please, please send someone." Her voice broke into sobs as she crumpled into the chair beside Daniel's body. It couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But it was. The seconds ticked by like hours as Laura sat there, staring at the man she had loved for over 2 decades, now nothing more than a shell of the person she had known. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what might have happened. He had been fine that morning, tired maybe, but nothing serious. How could this have happened? Why? The sound of sirens pierced the silence, a wail that sent shivers down her spine. The flashing red and blue lights outside painted the house in a surreal glow as the first responders arrived. Paramedics rushed in, but their hurried footsteps only confirmed what Laura already knew deep down. Daniel was gone. As they worked around her, their voices low and professional, Laura felt herself detaching from the scene, floating in a fog of disbelief. The world outside the house was still moving, neighbors gathering on their porches, curious faces peeking out from behind curtains. Crestwood was a town where nothing bad ever happened, a town where everyone knew each other by name. And now, the news that Daniel Roberts, one of its most beloved residents, was dead, would ripple through the town like a shockwave. Within minutes, the house became a crime scene. Yellow police tape was strung across the front yard, turning the picture-perfect home into something grotesque, something out of a nightmare. The neighbors gathered, whispering in hushed tones, speculating. There was no doubt, something terrible had happened. Detective Thomas Reeves was the first on the scene, his seasoned eyes scanning the room with the calm detachment that came from years of experience. At 48, with graying hair and a grim expression permanently etched into his features, he had seen more than his fair share of tragedies, but something about this one felt different. His partner, Detective Sarah Benson, arrived moments later, her sharp eyes immediately taking in the scene. Benson, meticulous and methodical, had a reputation for being relentless when it came to uncovering the truth. As they entered the living room, the heavy air of grief and confusion hung thick around them. Laura sat at the kitchen table, her face pale, eyes wide and glassy, her hands clutching a tissue that was already soaked with tears. Reeves approached her slowly, his voice soft but steady. "Mrs. Roberts, I'm Detective Thomas Reeves. This is my partner, Detective Sarah Benson. We're going to ask you a few questions about what happened here tonight." Laura's lip quivered as she nodded, unable to find her voice. She had already replayed the events of the evening 1,000 times in her mind, but none of it made sense. "He was fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He said he felt a little sick, but it wasn't serious." Reeves exchanged a glance with Benson. Something about this case felt off. Too clean, too simple. Daniel Roberts, a healthy, well-liked man, was dead, and no one had an explanation. But Reeves knew, in the pit of his stomach, that there was more to this story, far more. As the forensic team began their examination of the body, the house, and every inch of the living room, one thing was certain: Daniel Roberts' death was no accident. The town of Crestwood had been living under an illusion of safety, and that illusion had just been violently shattered. And as Reeves and Benson would soon discover, this was only the beginning. Laura nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. I'll try." Benson opened her notebook, pen poised. "You mentioned that Daniel wasn't feeling well the day before he died. Can you tell us more about that?" Laura blinked slowly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. He said he felt dizzy, lightheaded, nothing serious, just off." She swallowed hard, her voice faltering. "I thought it was just something he ate. He even joked about it, said it was probably just bad takeout. I didn't think." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hand. Reeves waited for her to compose herself before asking softly, "What did you do that evening? Did anything unusual happen?" Laura's voice trembled as she spoke. "I went out with friends. It was a planned thing, just a girls' night out. Daniel said he wanted to stay in, that he wasn't feeling up to going out. He told me to go ahead and have fun. I didn't think." She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears again. "And when you came back, you found him on the couch?" Benson asked, her tone gentle but firm. Laura nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I thought he was sleeping. I tried to wake him, but he was cold. He was so cold." Her shoulders shook with silent sobs as she spoke. Benson made a few notes, her face impassive. "Did Daniel have any health issues that we should know about? Anything that might explain what happened?" Laura shook her head, wiping at her eyes with the tissue. "No, nothing. He was healthy. He exercised, ate well, went for regular checkups. I don't understand how this could happen." Reeves and Benson exchanged a glance. There was still something missing, something they weren't seeing. "We're still waiting on the toxicology report," Reeves said carefully. "But we're going to look into every aspect of Daniel's life. If this wasn't a natural death, then someone might be responsible." Laura's head snapped up, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "You think someone did this to him?" Reeves leaned back, watching her carefully. "It's too early to say for sure, but we have to consider every possibility. Was there anyone Daniel had a disagreement with recently? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt him?" Laura's hands trembled as she twisted the tissue in her lap. "No, not that I know of. Daniel didn't have enemies. He was well liked. Everyone loved him. This doesn't make any sense." But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of hesitation, that told Reeves she wasn't being entirely truthful. Benson picked up on it too, her gaze sharpening as she pressed forward. "Laura," Benson said softly, If there's anything you're not telling us, now is the time to speak up. Even if it seems small, it could be important." Laura's lips trembled, and for a brief moment it looked as though she might say something. But then she shook her head, her eyes filling with tears once again. "There's nothing. We were happy. We had our problems, but nothing serious. I swear, I don't know what happened." Reeves and Benson didn't push her any further. They had planted the seed of doubt, and that was enough for now. As they left the house, Reeves couldn't shake the feeling that Laura was hiding something important. "We're missing something," Benson said as they walked back to the car. "She's holding back." Reeves nodded grimly. "Yeah, but she's not ready to talk. We need more leverage, something to make her crack." The toxicology report would be their next step. Until then, all they had were the whispers of a town trying to make sense of a tragedy that had no explanation. But Reeves knew, deep down, that the explanation would come soon enough. And when it did, it would tear through Crestwood like a storm. The toxicology report hit like a bombshell, changing everything Reeves and Benson thought they knew about the case. The poison detected in Daniel's system wasn't just rare. It was almost impossible to obtain legally. It was a highly restricted substance, used in specialized medical fields, and known to only a select group of professionals. This discovery instantly transformed the investigation from a puzzling death into a murder case, steeped in meticulous planning and cold calculation. The detectives realized they were now hunting a murderer who had the intelligence and access to execute a nearly perfect crime. But the more they uncovered, the more questions they had. Who had the resources to acquire such a poison? And how had they managed to get close enough to Daniel to administer it without raising any suspicions? Reeves and Benson convened with the medical examiner, dissecting every detail of Daniel's autopsy. His cause of death, cardiac arrest induced by the poison, was clear, but the timing was less so. The poison's effects weren't instantaneous. It took hours to fully incapacitate its victim. This meant Daniel could have ingested the fatal dose hours before he was found. But where? How? Laura, with her proximity to Daniel and access to his home, immediately became the prime suspect. She had the opportunity, but opportunity alone wasn't enough. What they needed was motive and proof. Without them, Laura's grief, no matter how rehearsed or genuine, shielded her from immediate suspicion in the public eye. But as the detectives delved into Daniel's personal life, the picture grew more complicated. Daniel had been a man of routine, but his business dealings at Robert's Construction Supply were anything but straightforward. Financial records showed irregularities, small, subtle shifts in account balances, unusual transactions that didn't align with his usual spending habits. It was as though Daniel had been moving money without anyone noticing, tucking it away into unseen corners of his financial empire. The deeper Reeves and Benson dug, the more they began to realize that Daniel's life hadn't been as squeaky clean as his public persona suggested. At the same time, Laura's own financial history came under scrutiny. Subtle patterns emerged, withdrawals that seemed too perfectly timed, amounts just below the radar to avoid attracting attention. All of them led to a hidden account. This account, as it turned out, was tied to Ryan Miller, a colleague of Laura's at her firm, and someone who had kept his personal life under wraps. The detectives were quick to connect the dots between Laura and Ryan. Their relationship had been more than professional. It was an affair, and it had likely been going on for months, if not longer. But how far did that relationship go? And did Ryan know more about Daniel's death than he was letting on? As Reeves and Benson pursued the truth, obstacles began to mount. Laura and Ryan, though separately under surveillance, were careful in their interactions. Any direct confrontation would risk alerting them to the investigation's progress. They needed evidence, hard evidence, to break the case wide open. But with each passing day, the case grew colder. Evidence that should have been there was conspicuously absent. The search for the source of the poison led them on a maddening chase. The restricted nature of the substance meant it should have been easy to track, yet every lead turned into a dead end. Hospitals, research labs, and pharmacies had all accounted for their supplies. No one had reported any missing vials. It was as though the poison had simply materialized out of thin air, used, and then vanished without a trace. But Reeves knew better. Someone had found a way to access it, and someone had helped cover it up. As they intensified their focus on Ryan Miller, more troubling details emerged. He wasn't just a man burdened with financial woes. He was drowning in them. His gambling debts alone were staggering, owed to dangerous figures who didn't wait patiently for repayment. It became clear that Ryan had been under immense pressure, and the affair with Laura had provided him with a lifeline, a glimpse of escape from his suffocating reality. It wasn't hard to imagine that Ryan might have been manipulated into doing something desperate. But had Laura really masterminded the entire plot? Or had Ryan, in his panic and desperation, taken matters into his own hands? As the investigation deepened, more complications arose. The forensic team's initial sweep of the Roberts home had come up empty, but on a second, more thorough search, they found something hidden in the least likely of places. A small compartment in the kitchen cabinet, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. Inside was a vial, containing traces of the very poison that had killed Daniel. The vial was a smoking gun, but it also raised another chilling question. How long had the plan to kill Daniel been in motion? And was Laura the one who had placed it there? Or had someone else involved in the conspiracy ensured it was kept within easy reach? The more Reeves and Benson dug, the more twisted the case became. Laura and Ryan's affair was only the surface of a much deeper, more insidious plot. Laura, it seemed, had been preparing for Daniel's death long before the poison entered his system. Her financial records revealed that she had been systematically liquidating assets, diverting funds into private accounts that Daniel wouldn't have been aware of. It was a slow, deliberate siphoning of wealth, one that suggested premeditation. But what was her endgame? Ryan, too, was spiraling. His involvement in the scheme had become more than just an affair, and an opportunity for financial gain. The weight of the investigation, the constant fear of being caught, was breaking him down. He had become erratic, his behavior increasingly unpredictable. He began missing work, dodging calls, and taking long drives to nowhere, his mind fraying under the pressure. The detectives tracked him carefully, watching for the moment he would slip. Reeves and Benson set up surveillance on both Laura and Ryan, hoping to catch them in a critical mistake. But the surveillance brought more questions than answers. Laura remained composed, never stepping out of line, maintaining her role as the grieving widow perfectly. Ryan, on the other hand, was unraveling, becoming more paranoid by the day. He had started avoiding Laura, something that raised alarm bells for the detectives. If they had been partners in crime, why the sudden distance? As they watched the pair, a new possibility emerged. Had Ryan begun to fear Laura? Was it possible that Laura had manipulated him into doing her dirty work and was now preparing to discard him, much like she had discarded Daniel? The detectives couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan was running scared, not just from them, but from something or someone much closer to home. Ryan's paranoia escalated when a package arrived at his apartment one evening. The small, nondescript box contained nothing but a single slip of paper, but the message on it sent chills through him. "We're watching." It wasn't signed, but the implication was clear. Someone was closing in, and Ryan was starting to believe that his involvement in Daniel's murder wasn't as secret as he'd hoped. Reeves and Benson, meanwhile, found themselves hitting roadblocks at every turn. The legal system, which had been their ally in building the case, suddenly became a maze of bureaucratic delays. Search warrants were held up by procedural issues. Witnesses refused to cooperate, and key pieces of evidence seemed to vanish just when they were needed most. It was as though someone behind the scenes was pulling strings, ensuring that the investigation stayed mired in obstacles. One day, when the detectives tried to secure documents from Daniel's business to further investigate potential motives tied to his wealth, they were met with sudden resistance from an unexpected source. Daniel's business partner, Alan Parker. Parker, once cooperative and seemingly eager to help the investigation, became evasive, refusing access to certain records. His behavior raised suspicion. Was he hiding something? Did he know more about Daniel's financial dealings than he had let on? The sudden interference from Parker sent Reeves and Benson down a new path of inquiry. Had Daniel been involved in something shady? And had Laura simply taken advantage of an opportunity? The answers were elusive, and the detectives began to wonder if they were facing not just one conspiracy, but several layers of deceit. The investigation into Daniel Roberts' murder had reached a fever pitch. Reeves and Benson had accumulated evidence, but with each new discovery came layers of complication they hadn't anticipated. The case, already complex, was now proving to be a labyrinth of deceit, not just in Daniel's personal life, but in his professional dealings too. What had initially seemed like a calculated crime of passion had evolved into a sprawling conspiracy with dangerous players at every turn. The revelation of offshore accounts and Alan Parker's sudden shift in cooperation had raised the stakes. The detectives, sensing they were on the verge of uncovering something far larger than Daniel's murder, began to investigate Parker more thoroughly. They scrutinized his role in the business, looking at how he and Daniel had run Roberts' construction supply. What they found was a chilling revelation. The company had been a front for laundering money. The seemingly legitimate business was deeply entangled in illegal activities, ranging from financial fraud to the movement of illicit funds through a network of shell corporations. This discovery sent shockwaves through the case, complicating the investigation and placing the detectives in uncharted territory. Parker, once a peripheral figure, became central to their inquiry. But his resistance to their efforts suggested that he was not just a business partner. He was a man with much to lose. He was hiding something far larger, something that could explain not only Daniel's murder, but the mysterious power structures operating behind the scenes. Parker's evasive behavior grew more suspicious by the day. He refused to provide key documents, citing legal reasons that did not hold up under scrutiny. His reluctance to cooperate pointed to a man's protecting not only his own interests, but potentially those of others far more dangerous. Reeves and Benson, suspecting that Parker was in deeper than anyone realized, sought out financial experts to help them piece together the complex network of transactions linking Robert's construction supply to the larger criminal underworld. As they delved deeper into Daniel's financial records, they uncovered a disturbing pattern. Daniel had been moving large sums of money, but the funds weren't going into typical offshore accounts. They were being funneled through multiple layers of shell companies, each one more opaque than the last. The money was eventually landing in accounts tied to foreign entities with known links to organized crime syndicates. It became clear that Daniel had been playing a dangerous game, and it was this game that may have ultimately cost him his life. The detectives' next challenge came when they attempted to obtain more comprehensive financial records from the institutions managing the offshore accounts. The banks, protected by laws that shielded their clients from scrutiny, refused to cooperate. Reeves and Benson found themselves entangled in an international legal battle, one that slowed the investigation to a crawl. With each delay, the likelihood of key evidence being destroyed increased, putting pressure on the detectives to find another way to crack the case. Meanwhile, Laura Roberts, now fully aware that the investigation had taken a turn beyond her control, began to make erratic moves. She had stopped cooperating with the authorities altogether, instead funneling her resources into a team of high-powered attorneys who specialized in financial crimes. Laura, once confident and composed, was showing signs of fear. She had been caught in something far larger than her domestic scheme. The danger now was not just the police investigation, but the shadowy figures connected to the offshore dealings. People who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate her if she became a liability. Ryan Miller, despite his cooperation, had begun to unravel. He had become a shell of the man he once was. The strain of the investigation leaving him broken. As he had always feared, Ryan was now being watched, not just by the detectives but by others. Unseen forces lurking in the background. He became paranoid, convinced that someone was after him, someone tied to Daniel's business dealings. This paranoia wasn't unfounded. On more than one occasion, Ryan had noticed a car following him, shadowy figures who disappeared the moment he tried to confront them. Reeves and Benson, concerned for Ryan's safety and hoping to extract more information from him, decided to place him under protective surveillance. But it was too late. Ryan, terrified and isolated, had already made a desperate decision to flee. The detectives tracked him down in a motel on the outskirts of town, where they found him in a near-delirious state. He hadn't slept in days, his mind racing with images of faceless men who, he claimed, were sent to kill him. Ryan, barely coherent, admitted to being involved in Daniel's murder, but insisted that the real danger came from Daniel's financial dealings. He feared not just the police, but the people tied to the offshore accounts, people who had a vested interest in keeping their business secret. This revelation shifted the investigation once again. Reeves and Benson realized that Daniel's death wasn't just about greed or revenge. It was about power. Whoever had orchestrated the financial web had done so with the intent of concealing millions of dollars in illegal transactions. Daniel's murder had been part of a larger strategy to maintain control of that money. And Laura, whether she realized it or not, had been playing right into their hands. The breakthrough came when the detectives discovered that Daniel had been in contact with a financial whistleblower just days before his death. This individual, an insider who had worked with one of the foreign banks managing the offshore accounts, had reached out to Daniel, offering to expose the full extent of the criminal network in exchange for protection. Daniel, according to the emails found on his computer, had been preparing to cut a deal that would have brought down not only his business but the entire web of financial corruption. Reeves and Benson knew this was the key to the case. Daniel hadn't just been a victim of domestic betrayal. He had been silenced before he could blow the whistle on a massive criminal conspiracy. But this also meant that whoever had ordered his death had far more resources and reach than they had initially imagined. The detectives worked frantically to track down the whistleblower, but when they finally located him, it was too late. The man had been found dead in his apartment, the victim of an apparent overdose. However, the circumstances of his death were suspicious. There were no signs of struggle, and the scene had been meticulously staged to look like a suicide. It was clear to Reeves and Benson that someone had silenced him before he could talk. This murder within a murder added another layer of complexity to the case. pushing the investigation into a realm far beyond what they had anticipated. Now, not only were they dealing with Daniel's murder, but they were also facing a powerful organized network that was willing to kill to protect its interests. As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, Reeves and Benson found themselves at odds with their superiors. The higher-ups were reluctant to pursue the case further, fearing the political and international fallout that could result from exposing such a large-scale operation. The pressure to drop the case mounted, but Reeves, refusing to back down, pushed forward. The final breakthrough came when the forensic team recovered deleted files from Daniel's encrypted server. These files contained detailed records of every transaction, every offshore account, and every person involved in the criminal network. It was a goldmine of evidence, enough to bring down not only Laura and Alan Parker, but the entire web of financial corruption. But with this discovery came new dangers. The detectives knew that the moment these files became public, they would be putting their lives and the lives of everyone involved at risk. As Reeves and Benson prepared to move forward with the evidence, they received an anonymous warning, a simple message delivered to their office, with no traceable sender. It read, "You're getting too close. Stop, or you'll regret it." This was no idle threat. The people behind Daniel's murder were watching the detectives' every move, and they were prepared to take drastic action to protect their interests. Reeves and Benson, knowing they were now being targeted, doubled their efforts to protect the evidence. They moved the files to secure locations, placing them under the guard of trusted federal agents. But the threats escalated. One evening, Reeves returned home to find that his house had been broken into. Nothing had been stolen, but the message was clear. He was being watched. Someone had entered his home, gone through his personal belongings, and left without a trace. Benson, too, began receiving anonymous calls at all hours of the night, the voice on the other end never speaking, just breathing heavily before hanging up. Despite the growing danger, the detectives refused to back down. They knew that they were on the verge of exposing a massive criminal network, one that had already claimed the lives of Daniel Roberts, his whistleblower contact, and possibly more victims yet to be uncovered. As the investigation came to its climax, Laura Roberts made one last desperate move. She had been on the run, trying to cover her tracks and distance herself from the growing chaos. But with her resources dwindling and the net closing in around her, Laura turned to the only person she thought could help her escape, Alan Parker. Parker, however, had already cut a deal with the criminal syndicate. In exchange for his safety, he had agreed to betray Laura, offering her up as a sacrificial pawn in the larger game. Laura, once the architect of her own scheme, had become expendable. Parker led her into a trap, luring her to a remote location where she believed she would be safe, only to turn her over to the very people she had tried to manipulate. Reeves and Benson, tracking Laura's movements through surveillance, arrived just in time to witness the final betrayal. Laura, realizing too late that she had been double-crossed, tried to flee, but there was no escape. She was arrested on the spot, her empire of lies and deceit crumbling around her, as Laura Roberts stood in handcuffs, surrounded by police and flashing lights. The weight of her downfall crashed down upon her. The woman who had once held the threads of manipulation in her hands was now just another criminal, trapped in the web she had woven. Her face, once carefully composed, showed no emotion, only a hollow, defeated expression as she was led to the police vehicle. For Reeves and Benson, Laura's arrest should have felt like a victory. After all, they had finally captured the woman responsible for Daniel's death. But there was no sense of closure, no real sense of triumph. They both knew that Laura, for all her scheming, was only a pawn in a much larger, more dangerous game. Alan Parker's betrayal of Laura had sealed her fate, but Parker himself was still free, protected by the criminal syndicate that had orchestrated Daniel's murder and countless other crimes that remained hidden in the shadows. Back at the station, Laura was questioned for hours, though she remained eerily quiet throughout the interrogation. The confident, manipulative woman who had spun lies so effortlessly in the past was now unresponsive, her spirit seemingly broken. She knew that the syndicate had turned against her, and whatever deal she had once thought she had was gone. Laura was no longer useful to them, and worse, she was now a liability. The case had become more dangerous than Reeves and Benson had anticipated. The syndicate's reach was vast, extending beyond the borders of Crestwood and into international territories. And though they had Laura in custody, it was clear that the people pulling the strings had already begun erasing any trace of their involvement in the larger conspiracy. Files disappeared, key witnesses vanished, and every lead seemed to dissolve just as they got close. Alan Parker, now fully under the syndicate's protection, had gone into hiding. Despite the detectives' best efforts, they couldn't locate him. The criminal organization that had shielded him was too powerful, their connections too deep. Even federal authorities found themselves stonewalled. unable to make progress without risking exposure to higher levels of corruption. Reeves, frustrated by the slow-moving gears of justice, began to sense the strain of the investigation on his own life. The break-in at his home had rattled him more than he'd let on, and now, with Laura in custody, he was left wondering what would come next. His phone rang constantly, anonymous calls, cryptic threats, each one a reminder that he and Benson were not safe. The case had become personal, and the enemies they faced were invisible, but ever-present, lurking in the shadows. Benson, ever pragmatic, doubled down on her efforts to protect the evidence they had gathered. The files they had secured on Daniel's financial dealings had been moved to federal custody, but even that felt tenuous. Every day they were reminded that they were playing a dangerous game against adversaries who had no qualms about eliminating threats. Days passed, and the pressure mounted. Laura remained in custody, her once iron resolve now crumbling under the weight of her inevitable fate. But while Laura's trial seemed imminent, the larger questions loomed. Would they ever bring Alan Parker to justice? Could they expose the full extent of the syndicate's criminal empire? Or would it all be swept under the rug, leaving Daniel's murder as just another unsolved crime? Its deeper truths buried? The investigation took another unexpected turn when an anonymous tip was sent to the station. The tip provided details about a warehouse on the outskirts of Crestwood, a location that had never come up in the investigation until now. The warehouse was said to be a front for the syndicate's operations, and though the tip was vague, it was enough for Reeves and Benson to act on. The detectives knew they couldn't trust anyone else with the information, not after all the obstructions they had faced. This was something they would have to handle themselves, quietly and carefully. When they arrived at the warehouse, the scene was eerie in its stillness. The building was old, its windows boarded up, and it had looked abandoned. But as they stepped inside, it became clear that it was anything but. The warehouse was filled with crates, containers marked with nondescript codes and foreign labels. As they moved further inside, the enormity of what they had discovered became apparent. The crates contained evidence of the syndicate's vast operations, counterfeit money, stolen goods, and documents that detailed international transactions, all pointing to a global network of crime that had its roots in Crestwood. Reeves and Benson realized that this was the proof they had been missing, the final piece that tied Daniel's death to a far-reaching criminal empire. But just as they began collecting the evidence, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Reeves and Benson froze, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. They had expected to be alone, but the sound of multiple sets of footsteps told them they were far from safe. The syndicate had known they would come. The next moments were a blur of motion. Shadows moved in the darkness, and Reeves felt the cold rush of adrenaline as figures emerged from the shadows, armed and dangerous. The detectives were outnumbered, but they had no choice but to stand their ground. A gunfight erupted, the warehouse filled with the deafening roar of bullets as Reeves and Benson fought for their lives. In the chaos, Benson managed to secure the files they had uncovered, her eyes locking with Reeves as they ducked for cover behind one of the crates. They had the evidence they needed, but now they had to make it out alive. As the gunfire continued, it became clear that the syndicate wasn't just trying to scare them off. They were trying to eliminate them. Reeves fired back, his heart pounding as he saw one of the attackers fall. Benson, always precise, took out another, but they were running out of time. The warehouse was a death trap, and the longer they stayed, the fewer chances they had of escaping. Just when it seemed as though they were cornered, the sound of police sirens filled the air. Backup had arrived. The attackers, realizing they were outnumbered, retreated into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they had come. Reeves and Benson, battered but alive, were left in the wreckage of the warehouse, surrounded by the crates that held the key to bringing down the syndicate. The evidence they had gathered would finally expose the full extent of Daniel's involvement in the criminal empire. It would reveal the true reasons for his murder, the people who had ordered it, and the network of power that had protected those responsible. But it had come at a high cost. Reeves and Benson had risked their lives to uncover the truth, and now they would have to see the case through to the bitter end. The aftermath of the warehouse raid sent shockwaves through Crestwood. The files recovered from the crates were enough to initiate a wide-scale investigation into the syndicate's operations, exposing layers of corruption that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement and beyond. Federal agents descended on the town, launching an operation to dismantle the criminal network that had operated in secret for so long. Alan Parker, realizing that the walls were closing in on him, went on the run. But with the weight of the federal investigation behind them, Reeves and Benson knew it was only a matter of time before Parker was found. His betrayal of Laura had bought him temporary protection, but the syndicate, now exposed, had no reason to shield him any longer. Parker had become a loose end, and loose ends didn't survive long in the world he had operated in. Laura, meanwhile, faced trial not only for her role in Daniel's murder, but also for her involvement in the financial crimes that had fueled the syndicate's empire. Her defense team tried to argue that she had been manipulated, that she had been a pawn in a game far larger than herself. But the evidence was too overwhelming. Laura had known exactly what she was doing, and the jury saw through her lies. The trial became a national spectacle, with reporters flocking to Crestwood to cover every twist and turn of the case. The revelations of corruption, money laundering, and organized crime stunned the public, shattering the idyllic image of the town. The fall of the Roberts family was complete, and the once respected name had become synonymous with scandal. For Reeves and Benson, the case had taken a heavy toll. They had risked everything to uncover the truth, and though they had succeeded in bringing down the syndicate, the scars of the investigation would stay with them. The threats, the violence, and the constant danger had left their mark. But in the end, they had achieved what they had set out to do. Justice for Daniel Roberts and the countless others caught in the syndicate's web. Alan Parker was eventually captured in a sting operation, but by the time he was brought to trial, the syndicate had already crumbled. The network of crime that had operated in Crestwood and beyond was dismantled, its leaders arrested, its assets seized. Parker, once a man of power and influence, was reduced to nothing, his betrayal of Laura and the syndicate earning him a lengthy prison sentence. Though the case was over, the impact of Daniel Roberts' murder and the subsequent investigation lingered in Crestwood. The town, once known for its quiet charm and neighborly warmth, now carried the weight of its dark history. The Roberts home, once the epitome of success, stood vacant, a silent reminder of the greed and betrayal that had torn the family apart. For Reeves and Benson, the end of the case brought little peace. The syndicate may have been dismantled, but the scars of the investigation ran deep. They had uncovered a world of corruption and violence that had operated in plain sight. And though they had won, it had come at a cost. The trust they once had in the system had been shaken, and the lines between justice and survival had blurred. In the months that followed, the detectives continued their work, but the shadow of the Roberts case remained with them. It was a reminder of the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives, a cautionary tale about the lengths people would go to protect their power. Crestwood too began to rebuild, though it would never be the same. The town had been forever changed by the events that had unfolded, and the memory of Daniel Roberts' murder would linger for years to come. As for Laura, her life behind bars was a far cry from the control and power she had once wielded. She had gambled everything, and in the end, she had lost it all. Stripped of her wealth, her influence, and her freedom, Laura was left to confront the consequences of her actions, a fate she had never anticipated when she first began her deadly game. And so, the story of Daniel Roberts, Laura, Ryan, and Alan Parker came to a close. But the echoes of their choices reverberated through the lives they had touched, leaving a legacy of betrayal, greed, and shattered illusions.